Okay, hey everybody. Thank you for tuning in. My name's Paul Frazee. I work on the Beaker browser, and I also work actively on the Hypercore peer-to-peer protocol. Today I had originally planned to give a talk on the technical work of the Hypercore protocol, but after January 6th, when Trump and Parler were removed from the internet, I felt like it was a little more appropriate to talk about the values of decentralization. I want to talk about what we're doing as a community in response to what's been going on. So, the thing that most decentralizers have warned about happened. Donald Trump and an entire social network were deplatformed unilaterally. This was an exercise of monopoly power that many of us have talked about, debated, and often been motivated by. But I would say it is perhaps the most extraordinary irony that this didn't happen when truth became inconvenient for the different platforms. It happened when lies became inconvenient. The kind of behavior that led Twitter and Facebook and Amazon to act was users openly calling for violence and insurrection. It was people peddling lies about a stolen election and refusing to allow U.S. democracy to continue in its design. So, how are we as decentralizers going to respond to this? What does it mean for our work? I think we should take a little bit of time to pause and reflect on these questions. How we define ourselves in response to January will probably define decentralization for a long time. Let me share a little bit about myself first. As I said, I co-created the Beaker browser, which is a peer-to-peer web browser. We created a way for users to publish websites from their own device and to own their content. Prior to working on Beaker, I helped co-found Secure Scuttlebutt, which is a peer-to-peer social network. So I've been working in the decentralization space since roughly 2014. Now, while none of these projects have hit what you might call mainstream success, they've always had a steady flow of users. So there's just about always been some opportunities to learn and to be thinking about some of the challenges that I'm going to be talking about today. In 2020, the Beaker team spent about 6 months working on a new social network product. And we had it pretty much in fully working state, and then we scrapped it. The whole thing was working. We had social following and peer-to-peer tweets and kind of a blog reader and lots of other things. It all worked, but we stopped for two reasons. The first reason was technological. One of our goals was to introduce new APIs into the web platform, which would make it easy for people to make their own social apps. And we realized that the quality of that work just wasn't really there. People kind of struggled with the APIs and so on. That's a normal product development concern, and we're working more on that now, which I'll talk about later. The second reason was a lot more important. We realized that we were solving the wrong problems at exactly the wrong time. It didn't take a whole lot of foresight to know that things were going to get a little bit weird after the election, and we frankly didn't want to be the solution for people looking for the next Parler. What we had done is created answers for individual rights and ownership, how to live independently of a platform, but we had really answered nothing about collective rights, how to deal with moderation and algorithmic discovery and information which shouldn't be owned by anybody, things like registries and user lists. We had a half-baked solution. It was all one side, the individual rights, and none of the other side, the collective rights. That made us ask, what are we trying to solve? When I talk to people now about the state of media and news, what I hear most is that they're confused. People don't know who to trust or what to trust. They can't even agree on the basic facts of what's true. That's an incredible indictment of social media and cable news. I mean, what are we doing? We made information networks that are disinforming. That's a failure of the stated goals. And we didn't get here because we didn't allow enough people to speak. We got here because we were naive about the process for moderation and attention. We rolled in with, who has the most likes or which YouTube video is also watched by the same viewers, and we didn't consider that that could be gamed, or perhaps not even gamed, but just lead to chaos. Listen to Tristan and Harris talk about this. So the problem that we're facing now, as we're talking about making new social media projects here, the problem isn't just centralization. The problem is the quality of the project. We're in an unhealthy media ecosystem right now, and that's what we need to fix more than just centralization. So we know the problems. Let's go through some definitions before we start talking about possible answers. First, let's talk about authority. Authority may be a lot of things. It may be a moderator, it may be an algorithm, it might be an identity provider or a data host. It could be purely democratic in its design, or it could be a single person sitting at the button. But authorities will exist. It's the nature of shared spaces and shared information. At some point, something will decide what maps from google.com to an IP address. That's an authority system. And it can't be solved by individual choice alone. We need global names. We need global consensus. So how do we design that system for consensus? That's what authority is about. It's about how a community comes to consensus about the state of the system. Decentralization is about distributing that authority. It's about who has the authority and how can they exercise it. It's not, however, about removing authority. That idea is an absolute fiction. When users have the ability to modify a shared space, there is some authority model embedded in there. Okay, so that's authority. So now let's talk about an idea of rights. Rights are guarantees about how the system is going to work for you. And there are two kinds of rights. There's the individual right and there's the collective right. In public and shared spaces, collective rights are what takes precedence. In the private and interpersonal space, individual rights take precedent. The actual rights can depend on the system. You might design the individual rights to be a right to an identity, a right to host or download data, a right to choose your own software, or to control the presentation of websites with ad blockers, things like that. Collective rights might be rights about moderation and how to choose the moderators, or a right to decide what trends and what that process is. Collective rights might even be details about how the software is built, like how many characters are allowed in a post, or whether or not the entire data schema allows upvotes and downvotes. Now, the collective rights tend to trip people up a little bit, but they are important. We engage with collective rights already when we use Twitter or Facebook. I mean, we don't expect any one person's like or upvote to determine what gets put on the front page or the trending section. We expect that to be a collective decision where each person is voicing their view, and then in aggregate, collectively, the decision gets made about what trends. So to summarize on the matter of rights, when we're talking about somebody's own data, their posts, their social relationships, perhaps their identity, we're talking about their rights as an individual. But when we're talking about shared data, what posts are visible in a community in a forum, or the assignment of usernames, or the ranking of search results, we're talking about collective rights, decisions that can't be made on a purely individual basis. And again, why do we talk about rights at all? That's because that's what makes moderation work for users. An individual right tells us what an authority can't do to a user, and a collective right tells us what an authority can't do to the community. Now, with both of these ideas, rights and authority, there's no one-size-fits-all answer. I would say it's not our goal as decentralizers to try to find one-size-fits-all, even though we kind of slip into that pretty often. No, I think our goal is to have a toolkit. We should have a variety of ideas about how to design these various questions so that we can build solutions that fit the need. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk about 4 tools for the toolkit that I find to be interesting. The first tool in our toolkit is forking. So let's talk about the most common form of forking that we're all familiar with in open source. Open source doesn't always mean that anybody can contribute, but it does mean that the users can fork if the core maintainers abuse their authority somehow. That ability to fork acts as a kind of constant constraint, a constant reminder to the people that are in that position of power. They know that if they abuse that power, it could lead to a fork. So they're incentivized to work with their users and try to behave accordingly. That's what somebody's described to me in the past as contingent authority. It's an authority that is contingent on the consent of the governed, right? Now that same principle can apply anywhere, not just on software repos. In fact, we've seen it multiple times in blockchains. The ability to fork some authority in a network means that you would copy it, you'd copy its data and its rules into a new place where other people can move to and adopt. And adopting that new authority would mean each of them configuring to the new endpoint, which would be a social process. But that same principle can apply into social media, or not even social media, just forums or any kind of shared space. And so forking, I would say, is a first and very important tool to have in our toolkit. And the easier that we can design our systems to be forkable, I think the better of a check that presents into the design of the system. That contingent authority is always putting a constraint, something in the back of the heads of the people that are making a decision on everybody's behalf, knowing that they could be removed. It might be the kind of technological equivalent of an election process. The second tool in our toolkit is a little bit abstract, but I think it's important. It's orthogonality. Orthogonality is the idea of systems that operate completely separately from each other. It's a bit like separation of powers in US government. Basically, moderation in one space shouldn't affect moderation in another, or the design of some other system. To give a kind of intuitive example, Google's identity system is integrated across YouTube and Gmail. That could create a situation where being banned on YouTube because of your, whatever truther videos cause you to lose access to your email. Thankfully, Google, so Stack Overflow tells me, did apply some orthogonality here. So if you get banned on YouTube, you're not going to lose your Gmail account. Glad to hear that. But that same principle needs to apply to any new system, because otherwise moderation could have unjust consequences and have a chilling effect on the entire thing. You should ensure that when a person's banned from a forum, they don't risk losing their email or their identity or all their data due to the whims of one given authority. That's, again, too much power to be putting in one place. This idea may seem obvious about orthogonality, but you'd be surprised how easy it is to have it slip into the design of new systems. Because when you tie things together, you get a lot of efficiency out of it. Ends up being the same risk as having one authority. It's certainly more efficient to have the systems be bundled together, but you need to be conscious of the effects of bundling them together will have, and looking to separate them out and you should be trying to separate them out in an orthogonal way as much as possible. Bit of a tongue twister. Okay, so let's talk about our third tool in the toolkit. So much for orthogonality. The third tool I want to talk about is cryptographic property rights. Okay, I'm getting really out there now, but let's hang with me. This idea is based on the ability to maintain secret keys, which are used to encrypt or sign. You could think of those secret keys as your property. Their operations prove that you own them, but you don't have to give away the actual information to do so. I would argue we should be looking for ways for people to possess those private keys physically, because they're effectively the keys to their property. Now, there are good reasons to have the keys be managed by services, because it's very hard for users to manage their own keys. But actual key ownership is what gives authority to those keys. So if users don't physically own the keys that sign their data and encrypt the data, then they're basically borrowing authority and borrowing secrecy from the third party who actually owns them. So if there were anything that I would wish the industry could solve today, it would be a usable solution to private key ownership. So that's cryptographic property rights. The fourth tool in our toolkit, and the last one that I'm going to describe, is constitutional social networks. Again, I'm out there on this, but hang with me. In some systems, it's possible to create what you call smart contracts, right? Software which has its execution audited externally, and therefore you can prove whether the executor is following the code. That's what a smart contract does. I'm going to say it again to make sure it comes through. A smart contract is software which is auditable externally, and therefore can be proven to be followed. The idea of smart contracts is what Ethereum is all about, but smart contracts don't actually require blockchains to provide that kind of external auditability. They require some cryptography, to be sure, but they don't require the kind of decentralized consensus. In fact, that's exactly what certificate transparency does. So why are smart contracts interesting? Well, smart contracts constrain the authority of an executor, such that they're really only able to run the operations that are specified in that contract. If the executor were to violate the contract somehow, whether that's a server or a miner, the users would be able to detect that violation and react accordingly. Whether they fork the authority, you broke the contract, you're out, we're going to somewhere new, or if it's a blockchain system, you just fail consensus and move on, things like that. So think about what this does. It introduces code which is independently executed. No matter who does it, that code is going to be followed. what we can do with that is produce communities which come to agreements on the contracts that are going to be govern their communities before they join together, before they join the community. The contract then acts as a kind of constitution for the network. Designing that contract would be an ongoing process. You'd have to make amendments to it, changes, and you would have to have some kind of process for it, which is like a legislative process, as with any governments. But when you're looking for how to constrain authority, that's the idea that excites me the most, because it sets very visible limits on the power that an authority can have. There's no jumping in the database and modifying some records to make things easier for whoever's running the thing, because that would break the contract. And hopefully there'd be no unilateral bans, for instance, though if the contract allows for it, it would be allowed. So you'd probably want to design your smart contract so that maybe more than one person has to sign off on a ban, and you'd be able to see what happened there. It would be put into the matter of public record. So this isn't like a perfect solution. None of this is. It doesn't solve the messiness of the governance or the hard questions about what gets moderated. But it does help build trust in how the system is moderated. And I think trust in the systems of authority is what we actually need to be solving now. So to wrap up this talk, I want to share some closing thoughts going back to this question about values. I would say there's nobody who could see the President of the United States being removed from every internet platform without pausing and reflecting on the power that those platforms wield. That is perhaps the only certain thing that all decentralizers can agree on, that monopoly power is a problem. But I would say that there is likewise no virtue in believing that moderation is an inherent evil. Free speech isn't something that we protect by enabling abuse. We protect it by giving it value. We protect it by making sure it's something that people want to protect. Otherwise, they will let it go. They'll shrug and say it's a nice idea, but it's untenable. It led to conspiracy theories and division. So we should recognize, I think, that chaos is a threat that is equal to monopoly control. For all our expertise about building decentralized systems, there are none of us that can contend with a nation that no longer sees the value of what we do. Beyond this foundational principle of free speech, as software engineers, we are designers of information systems. So what is the system that we want to design? That's the headspace I think we should be in. What are the attributes of the systems that we want to create? Surely among those attributes is a desire to spread truth, insight, perspective, self-criticism as a society, knowledge, and so on. Now, there are people that have responded to me when I say something like that by saying there's no algorithm for truth. Okay, but what are you engaging with every day when you engage with social media? It may not be designed explicitly as some kind of algorithm for truth, but there's definitely embedded in the network some system for deciding what information is getting promoted. And I think we should start by believing that that can be better. I mean, perhaps I'm wrong about that. Perhaps I'm naive to think that we should even be trying, but I've seen too many people engaging with QAnon to believe that this right now is good. When I see those people, what I see is confusion and fear. I see people desperately trying to understand the world around them and failing to do so, and I see the systems that we as an industry are responsible for creating, I see that as being responsible for their confusion. Conspiracies aren't coordinated, they're self-grown. They're the consensus of people looking to each other for truth and finding absolutely none because none of them know what's going on. But those ideas, those conspiracies spread because they're tantalizing and stirring ideas, and if they were true, they would be empowering to the people that believe them. And I would say, for that matter, it doesn't really matter if they're true to them because it acts as an organizing principle. QAnon has become a club that gives them strength. They organize around their conspiracies. So they're using information to empower themselves, no question, but they're not enlightening themselves. The free market of ideas always has buyers, no matter how bad the product is. It's especially true when the product is cheap. So what is our vision as decentralizers for the future of things like social media? What is it that we believe in accomplishing here? Because it's very possible for us to lean into the wrong ideas. That's my talk. If you find anything that I've talked about to be compelling, then you should check out a project I'm working on that's based on all these ideas called Citizen, which is designed around the toolkit that I laid out in the talk. I'm live streaming the work, so if you join in, I can chat with you in the live stream chat, and we plan out how it's designed together. So if you want to join us, you can find the link to my YouTube channel where I do the streaming in the talk notes in the talk description. So thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Have a great day.